You're watching the development vlog for Shokin, a multi-platform waitlist management tool soon to be made available on Android and iOS. This is week 52 of development. The current status is the Android alpha version has been made available and ready for testing on Google Play Store, and the iOS alpha version has just been made available and ready for testing on the iOS App Store through the TestFlight program. I'm quite excited about that. Last week, the task was to set up the CI/CD pipeline, deployment pipeline for the iOS app distribution. In other words, before last week, what I had to do was every time I wanted to upload a new version of the app to the TestFlight program on the iOS App Store, I'd have to go to my Mac, build the app, sign the app, and then manually upload the app through a web portal to Apple and manually submit the app for distribution. As you can imagine, that process is fairly error-prone as well as time-consuming, and the way to improve that is, of course, automating it using CI/CD, and that's what I did last week. So as of now, since it's complete, the process is that every week, I believe on Monday, the GitHub Actions runner would fire up a job to build the app and then sign the app and then upload the app and then request the app to be reviewed for distribution all automatically through the pipeline. So I don't have to do anything. It would, of course, email me if it runs into any build issues or errors. But because for every commit and for every push, I do have a iOS build verification. I doubt that that would happen very often. In any case, so that's done. The build and deployment pipeline is now complete for iOS. In addition to that, what I also did last week was implementing Google authentication and Apple authentication, specifically Google on Android and Apple on iOS devices. This is because I discovered that there is a big frictional point with regards to new user sign up. When a user tries to sign up for the app, before the flow is the OTP flow, the one-time passcode flow. The user would put in their email address and then they would receive an email containing a code, and they put that code in the app and then they're logged in. Sounds simple. The problem is the email that I'm sending those authentication codes from comes from a domain that I registered within the last year and really hasn't seen a lot of email volume. And as a result, it doesn't really have an email spam reputation. And this is a thing. It's like your credit score. So if you don't have a credit score, if you don't have a credit history, your credit score is crap. And if your domain doesn't have a spam email reputation history, its reputation rating is crap. So almost all of the authentication emails are being sent directly to spam folders of my users. This is not ideal at all. Despite the fact, of course, in the app, I tell my users to check their spam folders, but who actually does that, right? Nobody does that. You can't rely on that. You can't blame the user for things that they're inclined to do that you haven't figured out a way to prevent them from doing. So, and what you also shouldn't do is for your app's first contact point to have friction. I mean, the drop-off rate is high. If you ever watched a YouTube video, you'll know that the first like 15 seconds or 30 seconds have the highest viewership rate, and then it drops off a cliff. And you want to capture as much of that as possible. So to reduce the friction of the sign-in and sign-up process, one of the things I could do, I suppose, is to improve my reputation rating for my domain. But that's not within my control. That would have to come with people over time marking the emails coming from this domain as not spam, so that over time the reputation can improve. And even that, you can't really rely on that. When I go to my own email inbox, I constantly see a lot of emails coming from senders that I actually want to receive emails from. And Google, I use Gmail. I believe a lot of people use Gmail. Google is very aggressive with email spam filtering. In any case, so that's one option. The other option is, of course, just changing your authentication flow. And that's why I implemented Google authentication and Apple authentication. And To be fair, these authentication methods, when they're working, are even lower in friction to the end users, because the user doesn't have to go to their email inbox and fish out the 6-digit OTP code and put it in. They can just tap and, oh, they're signed in. Now, the prerequisite for all these authentication methods is, of course, the device itself has to be signed into Google as well as Apple for it to work in the first place. This could be an issue if you're trying to distribute outside the United States, but for my initial release, I'm not really targeting anywhere outside of the state, so I'm not terribly concerned. Devices in the US, you can safely believe that Android devices are all running on Google Play services authenticated against the user's personal account. And the iOS devices are, I mean, with Apple, I don't think you can use a lot of functions unless you log in. So that's what's happening. That implementation is complete. And right now, what my users can do is they fire up the app and then just press one button and then they can log in. They don't have to check their emails and they don't have to be concerned. Well, I don't have to be concerned why they're not logging in because they're not getting OTP codes. The funny thing about this, one of the things I did learn is that implementing iOS, Apple authentication on iOS actually required a bit more work than the Google side. The Google side, you can just do it in the app. I mean, like just change the, of course, you have to set up the backend linkage between Google Auth as well as your authentication backend. In my case is Supabase. That's, easy to do. Supabase provides a very nice web portal for you to do that. With iOS, one of the additional things that you have to do, perhaps not one of the additional thing that you have to do, and if you don't do it, it just won't work, is in order to enable Apple sign-up capability, Apple sign-in capability for your app, your certificate that you use to sign your app before you upload it to the Apple iOS App Store has to be granted the privilege of doing that. In other words, your old certificate, you can no longer use your old certificate because that certificate won't be able to sign this capability. You have to generate a new one. Now, that's easy enough to do, but if you don't do that, your app just won't work. But also because the certificate is updated, you have to update your CI/CD pipeline to use the new certificate when they're actually generating the build and assigning it before uploading it to the iOS App Store. So that's one additional consideration that you have to give for iOS devices when you're updating capabilities within the app. In any case, so to summarize last week, the two things that were done, number one, the CI/CD pipeline for iOS app deployment, and number two, the Google Auth and Apple Auth, respectively, on their respective platforms. I also learned something that's quite interesting with regards to the coding assistant I have been using. I have been using Codex from OpenAI. And for context, before this, I've been a long-time user for Claude, and specifically the Claude Max 20 times plan that gives you limited access to Opus. That's one of the jokes that people always use, like the Claude usage limits are like egregiously stingy. Like you can get onto their most expensive plan, and within one afternoon you'd be like halfway through your weekly quota. In any case, I left Anthropic at Claude not really because of the limit usage limit, but because the personality of Claude is just horrible. It lies all the time. I talked about this a couple of times in my weekly updates. It's not reliable. You cannot rely on Claude to do things for you. Codex, on the other hand, you can. If it doesn't know how to do certain things, it will just tell you. In any case, this is neither here nor there. One of the things I discovered about Codex, which is something that I was very pleasantly surprised by, was its capability to think out of the box to comply with, to finish what it thinks you want to do. So, and by the way, this is all on Codex 5.2 medium. So I'm not even using the highest thinking token budget. And so this is quite remarkable. On Claude Opus, you'd have to spend a lot of tokens just for it to think and behave like a half an ordinary human being. But on Codex, for whatever reason, and I still can't figure out, well, in any case, for whatever reason, Medium is very good for me, and I'm on a $20 plan per month. I can't run out of, for the life of me, I cannot exhaust my usage. In any case, so I ran into this situation where I'm developing on Linux. As you're aware, iOS deployments cannot be complete on Linux. You cannot build the iOS app on Linux. You have to build it on macOS. And instead of doing the right thing, which is setting up the correct macOS backend for my deployment, I just rely on my CI/CD pipeline to do the build and the build verification. A couple of times I ran into build errors, not on the Android side, but on the iOS side. So clearly something's wrong on the iOS side that I needed to fix. And of course, I'm using Codex to help me do that. And I discovered, without telling Codex, I was looking at the log. What it did was it started using GitHub Actions command, the GHCLI commands, to watch the build process in my GitHub Actions pipeline. And then after it notices a failure, it then automatically retrieved the error messages and then provided its analysis and proposed solution. This is wild to me. First of all, just thinking out, like, again, it's medium thinking token budget, right? And it's for whatever reason, I managed to think of this thing to do. This is beyond junior development level stuff, right? Number two, I'm not using a MCP server for this. This is GitHub GHCLI commands in the console. So it didn't even, in other words, what I'm saying is it doesn't even have a prompt that's inherent to an MCP server that would encourage it to use tools like this. It just did it by itself. And I was very impressed by it. I'm still very impressed by it. Speaking of which, one last thing that I did last week that I failed to mention earlier was I set up a Context 7 MCP server for my Codex instance. Context 7 is, for those who are not aware, a freemium service offered by Context 7 to provide the latest and most up-to-date documentation to your coding assistant when you're doing certain things. The problem that it tries to solve is that when a model is trained, like for instance, when the Codex 5.2 is trained, it is trained on a data that by definition, by the time you use, would be outdated data. And languages and frameworks and whatnot change so quickly that within a month, you'd have new API endpoints. You might have different syntax and stuff and different best practice that you have to follow that the model just wouldn't know. So that's one of the reasons why models would hallucinate. And in the past, what you could do was specifically asking the model to use its online search capability. In other words, the model would then make a tool call to its backend, and then the backend would then do a web search and then fetch the information for the model, and then the model can then incorporate the information that you fetch online into the responses that it would give you. Hopefully it's found the best in the newest practice and the syntax and whatnot. Now the problem with these is that, number one, when you're fetching websites, you're fetching the entire web page, and the entire web page contains a lot of junk information, like for instance all the scaffolding of the HTML as well as the CSS stuff, right? It all gets fed into the context of your current session. It bloats your context and it pollutes your context. So it necessarily reduces the quality of output if you're asking it to do a web search. That's number one. Number two, The funny thing is, a lot of websites are resisting being scraped like this. And this is one form of scraping. The automated server will go to a website and then would start, obtaining information without an end user interacting with it. So a lot of websites don't do that. And specific for Codex, I've noticed that it would actually complain in its chain of thought that it's been uh, like certain websites would prevent it from reading. And that's the other issue, which is like for a lot of websites, you just simply cannot get information. Sometimes it might be blocked by are you a robot thing. Of course, Codex can't bypass that. So online web searches are not at all reliable for getting the LLM, your coding assistant, the most up-to-date context information about the latest language features and framework syntaxes and stuff. So context 7 is the solution to that, or at least is one of the most prominent solutions. It's installed as an MCP service, Model Context Protocol service. And when your coding assistant, your coding agent wants to do certain things. For instance, when it wants to generate a JavaScript file or something, or use a particular new framework or new language feature or something, inside its context and in instructions, it would know to use the MCP server to fetch the latest information about that particular language, about that particular library that it's trying to implement, and find the most recent, up-to-date best practice, as well as syntaxes and stuff like that. It would then incorporate that into the context of its own before generating the response for you. And this obviously solves both of the problems that I mentioned earlier with regards to web scraping. Number one, web scraping pollutes the context with HTML scaffolding and CSS information that you're just not interested in. And number two, context 7 is always responsive. In other words, you would not run into a situation where context 7 doesn't respond or prevents you from getting the context because it's a service, right? It's an API call that you make. Yeah. And the free tier usage limit for context 7 is incredibly generous. It's 2,000 requests per day. And as far as from my personal experience, I'd be lucky to breach 100 per day, right? And so if you're running into latest documentation issues and stuff, sign up at Context 7 and give it a try and see if you like it. I found it to be really, really helpful. And its library is surprisingly vast. I didn't think, the frameworks that I've been using, a lot of them aren't really the most popular thing on the planet because a lot of people are still doing React Native or Angular in the web side of things. But it's got full support for a Kotlin multi-platform, Compose multi-platform, as well as the smaller libraries that I've been using in my project. So it's great. Anyways, this is a longer soliloquy than you've bargained for. But I did a lot last week, so I like to blabber about what's going on. But that's it for this week. I will see. Oh, what's up for next week? I had a plan. I can't remember exactly what I had a plan for. Oh, right. I need to implement the pop-up to remind the users to not hide their emails on iOS when they sign in. In addition to that, I also need to start implementing SMS notifications because I mentioned earlier my emails are being sent to spam folders. So I will need to bypass that by using SMS for the waitlist management. When a customer's time is up and then they'll receive a text to come. This is going to start getting expensive. SMSs are very expensive in the States. So I did that before during the first half of the year. That I don't think it was technically a very difficult thing to implement. It's similar to the email distribution. You just need a different backend and different backend services to link together. but I think I'm going to start spending money on it. That's it. That's it for this week. I will see you next week. But before I go, did you notice I have a cat here? He's been here. She's my program buddy. Oh, okay. I'll see you next week.